Dirt, Shame, and Sin in the Expendable Company of Jesus by Stephen J. Patterson. The Gospel of Jesus. What did the followers of Jesus experience in his company that moved them to claim that in his words and deeds they had come to know who God is? What was the goodness they saw in his deeds? What was the good news, the gospel, they heard in his words? And how did some people find such ultimate goodness in Jesus, while others experienced him quite differently? Indeed, not everyone experienced Jesus as good at all. For some, Jesus was an enigma, an oddball. What he said and did was to them meaningless nonsense. And among those who did understand him, the meaning of what he said and did was not all the same. For some, he was interesting, perhaps even amusing in his novelty. For others, Jesus was a threat, a danger to be dealt with, a voice to be silenced. But for some, what Jesus said and did meant something good. His words were heard as good news, as gospel. Their experience of him was redemptive, liberating, empowering. And for some, this experience of Jesus gave meaning to their lives in a way that only something ultimately real and authentic can do, and they gave themselves over to it. In Jesus, they had seen God. What was it that these first followers of Jesus experienced in his company that moved them to say that in this person they had come to know what God is really like? History and theology. In what follows, I will focus primarily on things Jesus is said to have done. His sayings and parables I have treated elsewhere. But focusing on the so-called deeds of Jesus poses some peculiar, some would say intractable, difficulties for the historian. When the Jesus Seminar began its work, it inherited a number of methodological principles from earlier generations of historians in quest of the historical Jesus. But most of those methods were designed to help identify authentic sayings of Jesus. When we tried to apply them to things Jesus is said to have done, we soon found that they were not very useful. For example, many sayings of Jesus are attested independently in multiple early Christian sources. Such multiple attestation is usually taken as a sign that a saying is very old and perhaps goes back to Jesus himself. In dealing with things Jesus is said to have done, we soon found that very few deeds of Jesus were multiply attested. Unless we were to assume that Jesus was a person who talked a lot but did little, we were forced to conclude that there was something about the way early Christians talked about the deeds of Jesus and passed these traditions on that was different from the way the tradition of Jesus' sayings was transmitted. We did not, and still do not, fully understand these differences, but we knew that the methods of earlier questers were coming up short as we explored this new territory. Perhaps the best provisional solution to this problem is to say simply that the deeds of Jesus present us with the creative memory of the early church. In the Jesus Seminar, it was seldom that we could assert, even tenuously, the historical accuracy of any particular event or occasion as it is depicted in the Gospels, or in fact that such and such an event ever occurred at all. But we did notice that certain types of events are depicted with great frequency in the Jesus tradition, and across a variety of sources and forms. Things like healings and exorcisms, associating with the unclean and the shamed, conflict with his family, such things begin to emerge as typical of Jesus in the widespread memory of the early church. Such typifications, as Bob Funk began to call them, became the basis for a general description of the sort of things Jesus probably did, even though the historicity of any single story in the Gospels was always hard to demonstrate. It seems then that what we have inherited from earliest Christianity, the creative memory of what people experienced in Jesus' ministry, and a collection of stories to illustrate and give form to the memory of that experience. The Gospels seldom give us what might be described as an historical event. Rather, we have stories born of memory, impressions of what Jesus was like. The limits of ancient history are considerable indeed. Needless to say, then, everything in this chapter is said with an implied probably affixed to it. But this is true of most writing of history. The work of the historian can normally offer only probability, not exactitude. History is not science. It belongs in the humanities building, not natural sciences. It can offer no quantifiable data, whose meaning would be self-evident to anyone. There is not even any clear starting point for the historian. History is always somewhat circular in its methods. One looks at the past through the memories of those who experienced it, gathering together the impressions left by events on the lives of people. In the end, the historian must try to render a reading of this collective mass of information. She or he must try to assemble it in a way that makes historical sense. he or she must attempt a reading of this amorphous collection of evidence that is fair and unprejudiced. But there are no guarantees. There can be no objectivity in history. We are all much too involved in the subject matter of history, human existence itself, to claim objectivity. At best, the historian can strive only to be fair, unprejudiced, and self-critical in looking at the past. Certainty always lies beyond the historian's grasp. But this should not be viewed as a loss, a deficiency of history. To the contrary, it is its very nature and strength. For we look to history not out of idle curiosity, but to ask about the relevance of the past for our own present. History does not ask a scientific question, but an existential one. One cannot observe history, one can only encounter it. For some, this lack of objectivity makes history an inappropriate medium for engaging in theological reflection. For me, it makes it the most appropriate medium. Like history, theology also does not ask a scientific question. To be sure, the age-old longing for certitude of faith, the desire to know beyond a shadow of a doubt the ultimate secrets of the universe, anxiety about death and the quest for security, all make it tempting to transform theology into a science. This is the impulse behind the dubious concept of creationism, which reduces the Bible to a pseudo-science with a false offer of scientific credibility. But the biblical text itself, a mixture of history and its interpretation, will not allow such an easy escape from the existential question posed to us by both history and theology, the question of meaning. What does human existence mean? The answer to this question is never automatic or self-evident in the way that answers to scientific questions might often be. Answering this question with authenticity is infinitely more difficult than answering any question of science, for it always involves a subjective commitment to seeing the world in a certain way. One cannot calculate the answer to an existential question like a mathematical equation. One must reflect on existential questions. One must ponder them. Answers do not come quickly or automatically. They must be tested in the living of them. For someone who believes in God, human existence means something because there is a God who gives life its ultimate meaning. To believe in God is to believe in a transcendent reality running through and beyond all things, a fundamental reality in which existence itself is grounded. Faith in God is an act of trusting in this reality and risking a life that is oriented to it. Thus, as Schubert Ogden has rightly argued, the question of faith in God always in reality involves two simultaneous questions posed at once. Who is God, and who must I become if I choose to give myself over to this God? Finding meaning in life always involves venturing an answer to both of these questions. To be serious about the God question is to ask about that ultimate reality without which life can mean nothing. Answering it seriously involves moving beyond any abstract ideas about what God is like and giving oneself over to the ultimate reality that is God. That is the risk of faith. When earliest Christians risked faith in Jesus, they were venturing an answer to this most pressing twofold question. We have found God in the words and deeds of this person Jesus, and we really are who he says we are to become. Who was Jesus, and what did he say or do that earliest Christians experienced as this kind of ultimate reality, a reality to which they could give themselves fully? This is to ask what Jesus meant to people. It is the question asked by both history and theology. The Basilia of God. How did Jesus describe what he was doing? The Gospels typically depict him speaking of his activity as the Basilia of God. Jesus announces the presence of this Basilia. His parables illustrate this Basilia. He calls prostitutes, tax collectors, children, and beggars into this Basilia. In the Synoptic Gospels, this term is used over 100 times. Jesus is depicted as speaking all the time about the Basilia of God. Quite naturally, then, this way of speaking has worked itself into the language of Christian faith. The common way of translating this term into English is to use the word kingdom. That is how you will find it in the Old King James Version and its descendants, like the Revised Standard Version and its recent revision, the New Revised Standard Version. That translation tradition was highly influenced by the Old King's English, in which one speaks of sovereignty using kingdom. But that translation long outlived the King's English from whence it came. It survives today as part of that special antique vocabulary one finds only in the Bible. Now people are beginning to translate it differently, for example, using the neologism kingdom, removing the androcentrism of the word king, and that is right and good. Some people are translating it as reign, reverting to a Latin base that is at least less recognizably sexist than the English word kingdom. Others are using the word rule. Religious terminology always demands this sort of careful attention. But how would an ancient person listening to Jesus have heard this term, basilia? When this word appears in a non-biblical text from the ancient world, it is usually translated as empire. It is a very political term. It is the word ancients used to refer to empires, or more precisely in Jesus' day, the empire, Rome. There is only one empire in Jesus' world, and that is Rome. Jesus took this very political term and attached it to the words of God. This was unusual. The term empire of God, kingdom of God, contrary to common assumptions, does not really appear very often in the literature of the Roman imperial period. But this is understandable. To speak of empire is to speak of Rome. And why speak of an empire of God, that is, an empire as God would run it, if one does not have something critical to say about the empire as you-know-who runs it? To speak of an empire of God is, well, risky, to say the least. But Jesus chose this very political, very risky concept as the central metaphor for expressing what he was about. Why? Rome and the world of Jesus. What did Jesus, a peasant from Galilee, know of Rome? Enough. Rome was not a distant, abstract reality to people like Jesus who lived in its provincial districts. Rome dominated Jesus' world. He lived and died about a century after Rome had taken Palestine by force and made it a province to serve its larger imperial aspirations. In the past, Western European historians have tended to give their cultural ancestors the benefit of the doubt on the question of how they came to control so much. It was, after all, such a gift, the great Roman peace, the Pax Romana. Augustus himself did not blush to boast. I extended the frontiers of all the provinces of the Roman people, which has as neighbors races not obedient to our empire. I restored peace to all the provinces of Gaul and Spain and to Germany, to all that region washed by the ocean from Gades to the mouth of the Elbe. Peace, too, I caused to be established in the Alps, from the region nearest to the Hadriatic as far as the Tuscan Sea. 2 armies were led almost at the same time, one into Ethiopia, the other into that part of Arabia which is called Felix, and large forces of the enemy belonging to both races were killed in battle and many towns captured. Egypt I added to the empire of the Roman people, and all of Cyrene. His work did not go unappreciated in verses penned by his pet poet, Horace, and sung by a choir of young men and maidens on the occasion of the secular games of 17 BCE. If Rome be your handiwork, then do ye, O gods, make teachable our youth and grant them virtuous ways. To the aged give tranquil peace, and to the race of Romulus riches and offspring and every glory. And what the glorious scion of Anchialus and Venus, a.k.a. Augustus Caesar, with sacrifice of milk-white steers, entreats of you, that may he obtain, triumphant over the warring foe, but generous to the fallen. More recently, however, scholars like Richard Horsley have begun to cast the Roman Pax in a different hue. One need only read a little between the lines of an historian not quite yet entirely co-opted by Rome for a glimpse of how Roman advancement proceeded in a place like Palestine. Josephus, writing more than a century after the fact, provides evidence that Jews had not yet forgotten how, in 43 BCE, when the towns of Gophna, Emmaus, Lydda, and Thamma were slow in paying their share of the Judean tribute, Cassius sold all their inhabitants into slavery. Or there was the time when the Roman general Varus quelled protests following Herod's death, shortly before the birth of Jesus, by sacking the great cities of Galilee and Samaria. Included among them was Sepphoris, just over the hill from Jesus' native Nazareth. Varus sold its inhabitants into slavery. The protests ended with the public crucifixion of 2,000 of the ringleaders. And what became of all those slaves? Rome needed them for the mines, the great Roman latifundia, the galleys. Rome built its empire on the backs of slaves. So someone like Jesus would have known about Rome and its great pax, but it may not have looked quite as good to him as it did to Horace. Jesus' sentiments might have been closer to those of Tacitus's fictitious Briton general, who has just experienced the Pax Romana at the end of a Roman lance. To plunder, butcher, steal, these things they misname empire. They make a desolation and call it peace. Rome organized itself into a great hierarchy. Marcus Borg, drawing on the work of the anthropologist Gerhard Lenski, has given an apt description. If one were to depict the shape of Roman society graphically, it might look like an old-fashioned oil can, one of those with a long, thin spout turned upside down. At the very tip of that spout, or perhaps hovering just above it, was the emperor. The empire was his to do with as he pleased. This may seem incredible in our own era of government by the people, of the people, and for the people. But Romans, as with many pre-modern agrarian cultures, subscribed to a proprietary theory of the state, wherein the state is regarded as a piece of property. The wealth and produce of the empire, at least in theory, belonged to the emperor and those to whom he delegated its benefits and privileges. The emperor controlled the means to life. Below the emperor, in that gossamer thin span of spout leading down to the funnel, were his subordinates, retainers, as anthropologists would call them, religious and military officials, local client kings, significant landholders, large-scale merchants. They benefited directly from the emperor and in exchange supported his claim to power. As one reaches the broader part of the funnel, one might find a few more merchants, traders, a small middle class who supported those above them. But most people would fit into that broadening, large, open end of the funnel, a vast majority of persons who lived as peasants, that is, at daily subsistence level. Most people in the empire lived like this, perhaps 80% of the population, on the very margins of existence. That is how Rome managed it. Rome's purpose, especially in the provinces, was to suck up as many of a province's resources as it could, without provoking it into revolt or killing it off altogether. It slowly siphoned the life out of places like Palestine. This hierarchical Roman order was based on something anthropologists might call a patronage system. A patron, let us say the emperor, had clients whom he supported. They, in turn, supported him. But they also had clients whom they supported, who in turn gave them support from below. And so it went, down through the ever-widening social pyramid, a kind of giant Amway scheme, with the means to life trickling down the system in a tightly managed quid pro quo system of distribution. John Dominic Crossan described this system in its totality as the brokered empire, wherein the means to life are always carefully brokered from the top down. Such a system, of course, works best for those near its apex, but it works also for those vast crowds of peasants living just at the margins of subsistence. They get just enough, but enough, to live. But in a patronage system, there are always a few, sometimes quite a few, who do not have anything to offer a patron. In the quid pro quo system, they have no quid to offer for quo. In a patronage system, anyone who has nothing to offer someone above them gradually falls down through the social pyramid and eventually out through the cracks in the bottom of the system. Lenski calls these persons expendables. They are expendable because they have nothing to offer their culture that might be considered of value. These are the beggars and the homeless. These are persons who might do those jobs no one else would do, like tax collecting. These are persons whose person counts for nothing, like prostitutes. With so many people living at the margins of existence, a significant number of expendables were always an inevitability, with persons moving in and out of that status all of the time. Take, for example, the situation of agricultural day laborers. If they are fortunate enough to get a full day's work, then they will receive enough pay to eat for a day. That is what subsistence means. One can earn enough for one day's sustenance, but that is all. There is no savings account put away for a rainy day. When it rains, you beg or you starve. For a peasant living at a subsistence level, expendability is only one day away. Jesus and expendables. Where did Jesus fit into this pyramidal system of patronage and brokerage? He did not fit. In the Gospels, canonical and non-canonical, and in Paul, in the broad memory and praxis of the early church, Jesus is recalled as living outside the system of brokered power and economy of Rome's empire. He was an itinerant teacher who scrounged for a living and encouraged others to do so as well. Whether he did this as one who chose to opt out of the system, or whether he himself was expendable to it, is a matter of dispute, for there is evidence on both sides of the question. On the one hand, Jesus is depicted in the Gospels as inviting people to give up their place in the web of brokerage and become a beggar like him. Consider, for example, Mark's story of the wealthy young man who comes to Jesus asking, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Mark 10:17-22. Initially, Jesus gives him the stock answer of his culture. You know the commandments. But not wishing to be dismissed so easily, the young man persists until Jesus gives him the real answer. You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you own and give it to beggars, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. At that, the man turns away, unable to risk removing himself from the security of the web of brokerage and patronage. Originally, the story probably ended with something like the saying in Mark 10:23, an originally independent saying which the Jesus Seminar designated pink. How hard it will be for those with riches to come into the empire of God. This story itself is not demonstrably historical, but it fits together with enough similar material in the gospel tradition to appear as an accurate typification of Jesus' ways. Jesus is depicted in all 4 canonical gospels as an itinerant preacher. He invites people to leave gainful activities to become his followers. In Thomas, he advises, become itinerants, Thomas 42. And from the Apostle Paul's itinerant lifestyle, going from place to place as the Spirit moved him, we can see what is likely the continuation of this practice in the activity of the early church. The pattern seems clearly to suggest an imperative. If you are in the imperial web of brokerage and patronage, get out of it. On the other hand, Jesus not only asks people to risk becoming expendable to the empire, he seems to be constantly in the company of persons who already are expendable to it, like tax collectors and prostitutes. Jesus most certainly kept company with known prostitutes. It is difficult to imagine that an emergent church seeking at least some amount of respectability from the world around it would have created the tradition that Jesus cavorted with prostitutes. It is unlikely, then, that the church can be credited with coining the saying, tax collectors and prostitutes go into the empire of God before you, Matthew 21:31. It is difficult to imagine the church even preserving the tradition, unless, of course, this was crucial to how it had come to understand itself in the followership of Jesus. Luke has a story that, in this light, appears as an accurate typification of how Jesus related to prostitutes. In this story, Luke 7:36-50, Jesus is having dinner at the table of a Pharisee. Luke perhaps sets it up this way to accentuate the purity concerns raised by this story, concerns represented in Luke's worldview by the Pharisaic party. A woman enters, introduced as a woman who was a sinner in this city, which we may take as a circumlocution for prostitute. If there's any doubt about this, the unfolding scene removes it. Standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, wiping them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet. Odd as it may seem to modern sensibilities, this business with the tears and dabbing them up with the hair is a detail drawn from ancient erotica, as may be seen, for example, in Xenophon's Ephesian tale. This is what impassioned lovers do. She comes on to Jesus. This, quite naturally, alarms the host. He says to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. But Jesus does not reject her. Instead, he turns to the host and says, I think one may fairly insert a wink here and perhaps a coy, slightly mocking tone of voice. Do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in she has not stopped kissing my feet. In a clever turnabout, the unseemly act of a prostitute is received as proper hospitality. She is accepted as she is, doing what she does. Now, Luke's Jesus is no fool. He knows about prostitution, its causes, its hazards, its humiliations. So in the end he says to her, your sins are forgiven, your faith has saved you, go in peace, which means, I think, you are no longer a prostitute. This story is probably not strictly historical. It is offered as a typification for how Jesus regarded prostitutes. They are expendable to the empire, but they are welcome in Jesus' new empire of God. So are tax collectors. There persists today the common assumption that a tax collector was someone who, far from expendable, enjoyed a comfortable, profitable niche in the Roman imperial system, as would be illustrated by Luke's well-known story of Zacchaeus, Luke 19:1-9. Though not a popular figure, 19:7, Zacchaeus is obviously someone with ample access to the means of life, but Luke calls him a chief tax collector, that is, a tax farmer. He is not the run-of-the-mill collector of tolls and taxes. People like Zacchaeus would typically have engaged subordinates to do the actual work of collecting. Levi, whom Mark depicts as sitting in his toll booth when Jesus comes along and calls him away, Mark 2:14, is such a tax collector. One need only imagine how pleasant a task it would have been to collect Roman tribute from strapped peasants barely making it as it is, to arrive quickly at the profile of such a tax collector. These were persons who could find no other means of making a living. Frequently slaves were purchased for this work. They did not last long. In a sense, one might regard tax collector as the male equivalent to the female role of prostitute. Tax collectors and prostitutes are both expendable in the empire, but they are included first in the empire of God. We may add to this list lepers, beggars, the blind, those who could not walk or speak, the mentally ill, possessed, all of them expendables, in whose company we are apt to find Jesus in the Gospels. Thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. Matthew 20:16. What about Jesus himself? Was he also an expendable? He may have been. There is a tradition, well known and popular but poorly attested, that Jesus was a tekton, a carpenter. See Mark 6:3. In an industrial culture based on the trading of manufactured goods, such a skill would have made Jesus an artisan, part of a class raised slightly above that of the mere peasant. For this reason, many have uncritically assumed that Jesus was part of the ancient middle class. However, Jesus did not live in an industrial culture, but the pre-industrial agrarian culture of the ancient world. The basic economic engine in an agrarian culture is the land. Peasants hold land and can therefore participate in the economy. Without the land, they are nothing. In agrarian cultures, the artisan class was usually recruited from among those who had been dispossessed of their land. A skill, a craft, a trade is all that stands between them and starvation. As Lenski has observed, in an agrarian culture, artisans generally rank below the peasant class, not above it. So if Jesus was in fact a carpenter, he would have occupied that tenuous, narrow band of subsistence hovering just above expendability. On off days, weeks, months, Jesus, like others in his position, would have had to beg for a living. Jesus knew expendability, he knew expendables, and he invited those who had not fallen out of the Roman system of brokerage and patronage to step out voluntarily and to become part of a new thing, the empire of God. Why? How did Jesus' words and deeds address the condition of expendability among peasants in provincial Rome? To explore this question, we must inquire further into the human experience of expendability. The experience of an expendable person in antiquity included 3 dimensions, each of which Jesus addressed directly. The experience of being unclean, not clean, the experience of shame, not honor, and the experience of being regarded as sinful, not righteousness. Unclean, not clean. Expendables in Jesus' world experienced being unclean, not clean. To be unclean is, in a literal sense, to be dirty. Of course, in human culture, the distinction between the clean and the unclean is far more complicated than this. Nonetheless, one may perhaps get at this very complicated dynamic by beginning with dirt. Dirt is, to quote Mary Douglas's well-known definition, simply matter out of place. Dirt in a field is soil. The same stuff on your face is, well, dirt. Food on your plate is appetizing. The very same matter on your clothes makes them dirty. Distinctions between what is clean and unclean go to the very basic impulse in every human culture to create order from chaos. Such distinctions, sometimes functional, sometimes not, create order and place. They include not only things, but behaviors as well. Such distinctions are present across all human cultures, but they are not at all identical. What is clean and unclean can be very culturally specific. For example, in the United States, it is generally considered unclean to eat a cat, since they do not belong to the category of things called food. A cat does not go on a plate. They belong to the pet category. Cows, on the other hand, do belong to the food category and so can be eaten. In other lands, however, those categories might be reversed. In some parts of India, cows belong to the category of things called sacred. To eat one would be a religiously unclean act, a sacrilege. And I am told, much to my personal revulsion, that there are places where it is perfectly acceptable to eat a cat. But the revulsion I feel is culturally specific. It must be inculcated in my upbringing. In this way, observance of the basic distinctions between what is clean and unclean can signal one's belonging to a social group. Failure to observe such codes can indicate that one does not belong and so result in ostracizing. Such distinctions must be learned. They are not automatic. I grew up in a rural part of America where many children from remote farms and ranches were educated in one-room schoolhouses until the 8th grade, and then sent to town for the high school years. This worked fine most of the time, but occasionally a child from a remote and recluse family would show up in town for the 9th grade completely unprepared for the society that awaited them there. How to dress, how to act with other children, how to eat in the cafeteria, tastes, social graces were all a mystery. If the child could somehow overcome the ostracizing that usually resulted, they might eventually learn how to fit in. But the interim period was always very painful. Distinctions between clean and unclean must be learned. They must also be cultivated. This takes time and resources. Take, for example, the simple matter of clean clothing. It must be washed, which presumes a place to wash and an extra set of clothes to wear while the other is being laundered. Simple things for most people, but anyone who has ever experienced an urban shelter for the homeless in our own culture knows the problem this poses for expendables. Or consider food. Clean food must be purchased and prepared in a clean way. These are luxuries that the destitute do not have. Expendables are always having to accept matter that is not of their own choosing. Beggars rummage through garbage cans for scraps of food. They beg for what they can get. They wear what they can find. Prostitutes disregard their own desires and accept those of others. To be unclean is to have someone else's stuff on you or in you. To be unclean is to feel violated and dirty. Finally, in Jesus' culture, as in most, there is an explicit connection between being clean and being holy. In our own highly secular culture, it is perhaps a bit more difficult to see this connection. But it was not many years ago that the Saturday night bath was a weekly ritual for many families in preparation for Sunday morning worship. This connection between the clean and the holy is also why most people still dress up to go to church or synagogue. In ancient Israel, the connection between the clean and the holy was more explicit. Near the end of Leviticus, where the general rules of purity are laid out, the Lord says to the people of Israel, "If you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will look with favor upon you and make you fruitful and multiply you. I will place my dwelling in your midst, and I shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people." Leviticus 26:3, 9, and 11 through 12. To observe the laws of purity was to ensure the favor of God's presence in Israel, to reduce the offense of mortal profane life to God so that God would not abhor the Israelites and deign to be with them. The concept is illustrated more graphically in a telling passage from Deuteronomy. With your equipment you are to include a trowel. When you go to relieve yourself, you are to dig a hole with it and bury your excrement. For the Lord your God travels along with your camp to save you and to deliver your enemies to you. Therefore your camp must be holy, so that God may not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you. Deuteronomy 23:13 through 14. God has standards that should not be offended. This is why anyone who is rendered unclean must go outside the camp until such time as they may be cleansed. Sometimes this involved only a short period, followed by a ritual cleansing, as with a nocturnal emission, for example, Deuteronomy 23:10 through 11. When the unclean condition has a more permanent or long-term effect, one's ostracizing might last considerably longer, as with leprosy, for example. The person who has a leprous disease shall wear torn clothes and have messed hair. They shall cover their upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean!" And they shall remain unclean as long as they have the disease. They are unclean. They shall live alone, and their dwelling shall be outside the camp. Leviticus 13:45 through 46. The idea is clear. God, like most of us, does not want to be with the unclean. I once attended an urban church where, it was explained to me, the ushers were all fairly stout men, so that in the event one of the destitute people who inhabited that neighborhood should come in off the street, they could be escorted out of the building. A holy place is a clean place. Throughout the gospel tradition, Jesus addresses himself to the unclean. It is one of the most common typifications we can identify. Jesus eats with lepers, Mark 14:3. He has conversations with Gentiles, Mark 7:24 through 30. He welcomes prostitutes into his company, Luke 7:36 through 50. Jesus and his followers are depicted as habitually eating in an unclean manner. In response to the accusation that Jesus and his disciples do not eat properly, Jesus does not deny the charge, but rather responds, "There is nothing outside of a person which, by going into them, can defile them. It is the things that come out of a person that defile. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile? For it enters not the heart but the stomach, and then passes on, out into the toilet." Mark 7:15, 19a. Mark adds, "Thus he declared all foods clean," 7:19b. An appropriate remark for Mark's audience, at least some of whom must be Gentiles interested in knowing that Jesus did not condemn eating all their favorite Gentile foods. But the point Jesus makes in the story is really more basic. Nothing can defile a person. It is this point that addresses the situation of expendables. Their lives render them unclean. Beggars, lepers, prostitutes, tax collectors, they are all unclean because that is what life has dealt them. Jesus disputes this. It is not what happens to you that defiles you. It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For from within, from the human heart, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, murder, adultery. Mark supplies the conventional list, but the point is made. The power to be clean lies in the character of a person. Blessed are those who are clean in their hearts, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. Throughout the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus seems to be on a virtual crusade against unclean spirits. Mark begins the ministry of Jesus with this story. And they came into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he went into the synagogue and taught. And immediately there was in the synagogue a person with an unclean spirit. And he cried out and said, "What business do you have with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus reprimanded him and said, "Shut up and come out of him." And the unclean spirit came out of him, convulsing and yelling. Mark 1:21-26. This is an apt introduction to a string of stories in which Jesus casts out unclean spirits. Whenever they see him, they fall down and cry out. Mark 3:11. He exorcises a man with an unclean spirit named Legion. Mark 5:1-13. He casts out an unclean spirit from the daughter of a Syrophoenician woman. Mark 7:24-30. He heals a deaf-mute boy by casting out an unclean spirit from him. Mark 9:14-29. The disciples also have authority to do this sort of thing. Mark 6:7. And because of this activity, Jesus himself is said to have an unclean spirit. Mark 3:30. Engaging the unclean casts one into their world. He also heals disabilities and diseases that could render one unclean, like leprosy. And a leper came to him pleading, and kneeling he said to him, "If you want to, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said, "I do want to. Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Mark 1:40-42. What are we to make of these stories? As a modern person, I do not believe in the existence of spirits and demons. That ancient people did believe in such things helps me to understand the cultural context of these stories and what they mean. Jesus engages in battle the things that render one unclean and outside the company of God and humanity. His ministry meant inclusion for the ostracized. But did Jesus really do such things, or are these simply stories told about Jesus to give form to the memory of his activity of including the unclean? I am undecided. In cultures that believe in demons, there are certainly people who are reputed to exorcise them. Jesus could have been such a person. On the other hand, it also belongs to the mythic image of the Son of God that he engages the powers of evil and clears the way for the coming empire of God. This is Mark's way of thinking about it. His understanding of Jesus' exorcisms presupposes considerable early Christian theological reflection that arose only after Jesus' death. In the end, whether Jesus was a genuine shaman or whether he simply embraced the company of the unclean, the meaning of his memory is the same. In Jesus, we have come to know a God who renders impotent the power of dirt to keep the unclean outside the human community. Shame, not honor. Expendable persons experience shame, not honor. Honor and shame are two of the basic anthropological dimensions of ancient life. What is honor? What is shame? One way of understanding honor and shame is simply to extend into the social realm the thinking we have already done around distinctions of clean and unclean. Honor and shame, like distinctions of clean and unclean, have to do with place. To have honor is to have a place, a role, within which one is readily recognized by one's peers, a role whose functions one may competently perform. Like matters of clean and unclean, honor and shame have to do with expectations. One knows what to expect from an honorable person. Honorable people are clear about their role in life. They know what is expected and do their duty. On the other hand, someone who behaves in a way that is inappropriate to his or her role or to society in general is a shameful person. Such a person does not behave according to expectations. Their difference is discomfiting. They may even strike one as dangerous. In a peasant culture with only a minimal social infrastructure, honor and shame are the forces that give shape to communal life. In the world of rural antiquity, there was no police force, no lawyers, few courts. In such a culture, someone who steps out of line must be shamed into conformity. If a person proves impervious to shame and simply will not reform to the expectations of his or her peers, they are regarded as shameless and ostracized from the community. In most cultures, a set of reliable expectations for various social rules are necessary for the smooth conduct of social life. Another way of thinking about honor and shame is to consider how honor is acquired. Again, one has honor when one has a place in society, a role, within which one is able to function successfully. Acquiring honor involves 3 basic steps. First, you must aspire to a role, a place in your culture. Secondly, your peers must recognize you in that role. Finally, once you are recognized in a role, you must now be able successfully to function in that role. If all of this falls into place, you acquire a grant of honor. However, if at any point the process breaks down, you are shamed. If, for example, one aspires to the role of teacher but no one signs up for the class, one experiences shame for not having been recognized in the role to which they have aspired. Or again, if people come, but eventually walk out in frustration for having learned nothing under their tutelage, one experiences the shame of failure. Shame is a powerful emotion. It has physical as well as psychological dimensions. Shame is not necessarily a moral category. I'm not speaking of guilt, the experience of being ashamed for having done something one knows to be wrong. Shame is an existential category. It has to do with self-worth, with one's internal image of oneself, with one's sense of belonging and kinship. Here is an example to which most people can relate and recall the very visceral aspects of feeling shamed. Remember the first sock hop you attended in junior high school? I can recall it well. As I enter the doors to the gymnasium, I can see my classmates dancing and having fun. I marvel at their courage and abandon, how they all seem so natural out there on the gym floor dancing away. I aspire to be one of them, to be a dancer. But doubts subdue my ambition, so I take my place with the others sitting on the sidelines, not yet ready to take up the challenge. Finally, I summon the courage to ask the girl sitting next to me if she would like to dance. I am old-fashioned. I say, "May I have the honor?" May I? Will she recognize my aspirations to be her dance partner, or turn me down and shame me back into my place on the sidelines? I must carefully calculate this. How popular is she? Can she dance? Successfully negotiating the world of honor and shame requires careful attention to place, abilities, expectations. She agrees to dance with me. So far, so good. I have the honor. But challenges arise. My friends issue catcalls from the sidelines. My honor is in question. I must now successfully function in the role to which I have aspired. If I cannot, I will be shamed and perhaps never summon forth the courage to dance again. Fortunately, these are the 1960s and dancing is quite easy. My honor is retained. Shame has been averted, at least this time. But life is full of such situations. Honor and shame are ever-present realities of human existence. Not everyone pays attention to such things. For example, a person who chooses to disregard the shame of another is called a fool. Let us imagine that I was unable to dance. So the partner who had risked a dance with me decided to cut her losses and flee, leaving me alone, shamed, on the dance floor. Who will grant me the honor now? Only a fool who cares little for her own reputation. If such a person exists, she will appear as a hero to me and to all of the shamed, but to the rest of the dancers, she will be regarded as a fool. In the complexities of honor and shame, someone who chooses to ignore the shame of another is a fool. Or let us imagine that in spite of the fact that I have been abandoned on the dance floor, I ignore the shame I feel and simply continue to dance incompetently by myself. People will shake their heads and mutter, "Shameless." In the system of honor and shame, one who chooses to ignore his or her own shame is called shameless. Such a person is beyond the pale. They refuse to recognize honor and shame at all. Their behavior has become unpredictable, unreliable. They are dangerous and must be avoided. Jesus was remembered as a shameless fool. To spend time with expendables is to be a fool, to refuse to recognize the shame of another. Expendables are by definition shamed. To have honor is to have place, to have a recognized role. This is precisely what expendables do not have. They are expendable to their culture because there is no role in it for them. Beggars must beg with eyes cast down. They are shamed. Prostitutes are worse than shamed. They are shameless. Forced by their expendability into the sale of their bodies, they must engage repeatedly in behavior against which there are strong societal sanctions and taboos. They must ignore their own shame to survive. One need only recall the story of Jesus and the prostitute from Luke 7 discussed above to see how Jesus was remembered as a fool, disregarding the shame of another. There is much opportunity for shame around the issue of marriage and family. In societies strongly oriented to honor and shame, it traditionally falls to the woman to guard against shame in the family that might come from extramarital sex. This is why adultery is defined as the sexual violation of a married woman, but not a man, and treated so harshly in the ancient Near East. See Malachi 2:14-15, Proverbs 5:15-20, Leviticus 20:10, Deuteronomy 22:22. In conventional texts of John 8, there is found a remarkable story about Jesus and a woman accused of adultery, who is about to be stoned. John 7:53b-8:11. A case for its historicity would be difficult to make, since the origin of this story has become impossible to trace. The earliest and most reliable manuscripts of John do not have it. In some early copies of Luke, one finds it inserted after Luke 21:38. We do not even know for sure the gospel with which to associate it. It is what is sometimes called a floating tradition, something from the oral tradition that pops up in various places, but whose origin is not known. But the memory of Jesus expressed in it is so remarkably countercultural, it must have some claim to authenticity in representing the views of Jesus, even if its claim to historicity is weak. It presents us with a classic honor-shame confrontation. The woman in this story is accused of violating her given role, wife, and bringing shame upon her entire extended family. In her patriarchal world, her offense is so severe it warrants complete eradication. She must be stoned, a public, communal form of execution featuring the violent disfigurement of the offender. But Jesus defends her with a challenge of his own. He challenges the honor of those wishing to eradicate her shame. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone at her. And in the magical world of Christian storytelling about Jesus, that ends the matter. Her accusers all sulk away, themselves shamed by Jesus' challenge, beginning with the oldest, the most honorable. This story gives shape to a powerful memory of what Jesus meant to people who experience shame. Shame is like dirt. It renders one outside the human community and the company of God. Real shame does not come from within. It is not guilt. It comes from without. One must be shamed by others. But unlike dirt, it is not so easily washed away. Shame stays with you. No ritual ablutions can nullify its power over a person. It works itself into the image of oneself before others, and there remains as a part of one's personal landscape. In stories like that of the woman caught in adultery, early Christians gave shape to the memory that Jesus refused to recognize shame. No one has the power to shame, to castigate and ostracize one from the human community. The point is the same as with distinctions of clean and unclean. Nothing from outside can render one unclean. Only the things that come from the human heart can render one clean or unclean. So also with shame. One cannot be shamed from without. To be sure, one can feel ashamed. One can feel guilt and remorse for things done that should not have been done. That is why many of these stories end with the admonition, "Go and sin no more." But Jesus' insight was that it does not lie within the legitimate power of one human being to shame another and to cast them out of the company of God and humanity. There are many illustrations of this principle in the Gospels. For example, when the blind man Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus from the side of the road and is shushed by those around him, Jesus stops the entourage and calls him over. Mark 10:46-52. Or when Martha asked Jesus to castigate Mary for stepping out of her conventional role as a woman, Jesus refuses to do so, but acknowledges her in the new role to which she has aspired, disciple. Luke 10:38-42. This is also the framework within which one ought to understand Jesus' teaching regarding divorce, a traditional act of public shaming in Jesus' culture. He simply disallows it. Mark 10:2-12. In Mark 7, there is a most peculiar story about Jesus and a woman from Syrophoenicia, who asks him to exorcise her demon-possessed daughter. In Mark's story, Jesus responds to her request negatively. "Let the children first be fed, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." 7:27. She asks for something she cannot rightfully have, and so he shames her with a well-crafted ancient Near Eastern insult. But she refuses to accept the shame and retorts, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." At this, Jesus repents of his view, capitulates, and grants her request. It is the only story in the New Testament in which Jesus loses an argument and learns something in the process. Is this the tradition's way of shaping a memory that Jesus received his insights about shame from women? Jesus not only ignored the shame of others and so was a fool, he also ignored his own shame and so was shameless. He did not perform the role to which he was assigned in life. Jesus was a carpenter, an artisan, tekton, or so the tradition presents him, Mark 6:3. But we encounter him in the Gospels as a teacher, a wandering philosopher who speaks of God, who preaches. What qualified him for this vocation, this role? He had no training that we know of. As a peasant artisan, formal study would have been unavailable to him. The leisure and training to read and write, to study the traditions of Israel, to practice rhetoric, all of these things would have been lacking in his life. His situation is rather like that of the Cynic philosophers, railed against and ridiculed by the ancient writer Lucian in his biting satire, The Fugitives. Lucian has become fed up with this upstart philosophical movement he sees as dominated by untrained artisans, runaway slaves, and women who have eschewed conventional household duties. What his goddess, Philosophia, says of the Cynics could well have been said of Jesus and his followers too. There is an abominable class of people, for the most part slaves and common laborers, who had nothing to do with me in childhood for lack of leisure time, since they were performing the work of slaves or common laborers, learning such trades as you would expect their type to learn, like cobbling, building, taking care of fullers' tubs, or carding wool. Now, to learn all that is necessary for such a calling would have been a long task, or rather an impossible one for them. Their trades, however, were petty and laborious, and barely able to provide them with just enough to live. Lucian is describing the life of an artisan. For such a person, it is simply impossible to develop the skills to become a wandering teacher. He calls the Cynics shameless, and their effort at Philosophia counterfeit. In Lucian's elitist tale of social commentary, Philosophia sends Hermes and Heracles as her henchmen to track down a small band of cynics, 3 fugitive slaves and a runaway wife. Their fate is tar and feathers. In the Gospel of Mark, there is a story about Jesus coming to his hometown to preach and heal as he had done elsewhere. But at home, it does not go so well. When Jesus begins to teach in his home synagogue, the crowd begins to object. Where did this person get these things he is saying? What is this wisdom given to him, and what are these miracles done by his hand? Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph, Jude and Simon? And are not his sisters right here in front of us? And they took offense at him. Mark 6:2-3. This becomes the occasion for Mark to insert a famous saying of Jesus. A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house. And Mark adds, he could do no miracles there. Like other episodes from Jesus' life found in the Gospels, we cannot be sure that this one has any claim to historicity. But given what we know about Jesus, it has perfect verisimilitude. The issue here is honor and shame. Jesus aspires to the role of prophet, but his peers, even his family, will not recognize him in that role. They know him too well. They challenge him. They attempt to shame him into accepting his given role among family and kin. But he refuses to shrink back from what he has become in his own mind. He is a prophet now. But to the folks back home, he is shameless. And in the end, he dies a death that would seem appropriate to all but those who chose to accept Jesus as a prophet. Crucifixion was the ultimate act of shaming. Helpless, exposed to the elements, animals, and passers-by, staked outside the sacred boundaries of the city walls, the victim of Rome's signature form of execution was literally shamed to death. Sin, not righteousness. Expendables experience sin, or rather, they are regarded as sinful rather than righteous. With this category, we may seem, at least initially, to be on familiar religious ground, morality. But a closer look at the material reveals that this is not really so. For sinner in the ancient world is not just a moral category, it is a social category as well. Let us begin with an example from the New Testament to illustrate how the category sinner works in relationship to expendability. In the 9th chapter of John, Jesus and the disciples come across a man who was born blind, John 9:1-34. The disciples instinctively ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Notice the automatic connection between the condition of expendability and the assumption that such a person must be deserving of their predicament. One might be tempted to assign this way of thinking to some bizarre and ancient theodicy, but this is to be resisted. In fact, it is the most natural and psychologically necessary solution to the problem of expendability in any culture. What would one have to admit if no particular shortcoming could be ascribed to persons unable to find a place in the social world we have collectively constructed? The answer would be the deeply disturbing realization that there is something morally wrong about a society which is itself incapable of living up to its claim to offer a place for everyone. Moreover, this moral shortcoming would be one in which everyone who participates willingly in and benefits from the common social order would be, in greater or lesser degree, culpable. Examples abound from our own modern American social landscape. Women who receive ADC are not seen as persons for whom there is no place in our economy, but as lazy, dishonest welfare queens robbing the rest of us of our hard-earned dollars. Kids who deal in drugs to help support their families are not seen as desperate survivors, but as amoral criminals lusting after the latest designer tennis shoes. The governing assumption in such thinking is that if someone operates outside the boundaries of social acceptability, it is not because there is no place for them in the social economy, but because they are somehow deficient in themselves. They are sinners. This principle can be illustrated in another way from the traditions about Jesus. The following story comes from the Gospel of Mark. Like so many other stories from the synoptic tradition, its historicity cannot be proven. Nonetheless, when one thinks about the potentially damaging nature of this story in a world in which the fledgling church was struggling to rise above the suspicions of its neighbors, it is scarcely possible to account for his presence in the tradition apart from some claim to authenticity as a typification of what Jesus was about. And as he passed along the way, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in his tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And it happened that he was having dinner at his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were having dinner with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call righteous people, but sinners." Mark 2:14-17. This story is not isolated in the traditions about Jesus. In Q, there is preserved an apparently common reproach against Jesus. "Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Luke 7:34b. Notice how in both of these traditions a tandem term is created, tax collector and sinner. We have already discussed the status of tax collectors among the expendables. This sort of front lines tax collecting was hazardous work, performed by persons with few other options in an economy to which they were expendable. Now this term is placed alongside another, sinner, as though they were easily interchangeable. And so they were. Tax collectors were not seen as persons doing whatever they could to eke out a living, but as traitors, unworthy of the company of respectable people. Joachim Jeremias identified a number of such occupations in the social world of Jesus that suffered under a similar stigma, including shepherds, dung collectors, tanners, peddlers, weavers, bath attendants, gamblers with dice, bandits, and others. Not all of these occupations were despised as notoriously immoral. Tanners just stank. But all were despised for what they did, scrounging around the edges of Jesus' social world to earn enough to get by from day to day. They were all landless expendables. These are the sinners whom Jesus calls into his following. This is clear from how Jesus explains himself at the end of the story. "I did not come to call righteous people, but sinners." Mark 2:17. There is something missing here, is there not? Luke noticed it, and so adopted Mark's story, but added to the end of this sentence, "to repentance." Luke 5:32. But this changes the meaning of the original story completely. In Mark's version, Jesus does not call sinners to repentance, he just calls them. This does not mean that Mark or Mark's Jesus is amoral, for elsewhere he does speak of turning from one's sins. For example, Mark 1:15, cross-reference 6:12. Here, however, he is not thinking of sinner as a moral category, but a social one. In calling sinners into his following, he recognized the structural nature of expendability in his social world and the illegitimacy of labeling expendables as sinners in need of repentance. A tax collector does not need to repent. He just needs land or a better job. A prostitute does not need better morals. She just needs a legitimate, respectful place to be in the world. Jesus called sinners, period. He invited into his company those whose condition rendered them into a category: sinner, unclean, shamed. They all go together in Jesus' world. They are all categories of expendability. Jesus spent his time with sinners, lepers, people with physical disabilities, deaf people, blind people, people who could not walk or talk. He welcomed prostitutes, tax collectors, all manner of expendable people, and he proclaimed for them an empire, the empire of God, in which the means to life are free and accessible by God's own gracious hand. The unbrokered empire of God. Crossan calls this the brokerless kingdom. In contrast to Rome's highly brokered empire, the empire of God is that place where the means to life are offered freely. Jesus was an itinerant pundit who by his word and deed called into question the structures of his social world that dehumanized and made expendable so many human beings of God's own making. Indeed, he brought those expendables back into the human community. He regarded the unclean as clean. He treated the shamed with honor. He declared sinners righteous and able to stand in the glorious presence of God. Together, they created an empire. Not one in which the means to life are brokered from the top down in a complex hierarchy of quid pro quo transactions, but unbrokered, freely offered, like God's own love to all of God's children. Crossan has argued that this theology of unbrokered access is symbolized most clearly in Jesus' practice of eating with all manner of folk. Let us return for a moment to that story from the 2nd chapter of Mark, in which Jesus' critics question, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Mark 2:16b. A moment ago we noticed only the company Jesus kept. Now we should all notice what they were doing, eating together. This memory of Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners is confirmed and presented in the worst possible light in the Q tradition that contrasts Jesus' loose table practices with the ascetic practices of John. To what shall I compare the people of this generation, and what are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another, "We piped and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not weep. For John the Baptist came eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say, he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a drunkard and a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Luke 7:31-34. These words are those of Jesus' followers reflecting on the significance of Jesus and his fate. But in so doing, they preserved what must have been a common accusation against Jesus and the movement he spawned: a drunkard and a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It is presented as the exaggerated and unreasonable, and so obviously false, accusation of the opponents of Jesus. But there must have been an element of truth to the charge. There are several disputes around the issue of eating played out in the gospel tradition. See, for example, Mark 2:18-22, 2:23-28, 7:1-23, and 14:3-9, and their parallels in Matthew and Luke. One may also point to the considerable reflection in earliest Christianity around meals and mealtime practices, such as one finds in Paul's letters. See, for example, Galatians 2:11-21, 1 Corinthians 8-10, 11:27-34, Romans 14:1-23. All of these examples indicate in one way or another that the earliest Jesus movement engaged in table fellowship that inspired criticism and conflict over what, how, and with whom one ought to eat. What is the issue with eating? Eating together is a basic human activity, the significance of which can still be seen today if one thinks for a moment about all that goes into a common dinner invitation. There's always a tinge of anxiety that accompanies every dinner party. Will the guests accept my invitation? That is, will those whom I invite see me in the same way that I see them, as friends and peers? Eating together is a social activity that establishes group identity and boundaries. What are the boundaries of a meal? Whom shall I invite? Will so-and-so get along with so-and-so? Will she want to be seen with him? A meal is an act of social formation. And what shall I serve? Shall I offer the president of the corporation macaroni and cheese? What will show her that I respect and value her company, that I am worthy to be her peer? And what about next week? Will my invitation be reciprocated, thus reaffirming the common kinship that I have initiated? Common meals can be social minefields, but once established, the commensality of friends becomes a source of mutual care, affection, and social nourishment. That is why we risk it. In the ancient world, eating together was perhaps the most common form of social formation. Families, friends, associations of various sorts, religious and ethnic groups all gathered around their respective tables. The rules, the etiquette, the menu, the company were all tightly managed, just as they are today. Gentiles ate with Gentiles, Jews with Jews, men ate with men, women with women. Washing preceded eating, clean hands ate clean food. The host presided, the guests reclined, and the servants served. In the stories about Jesus and his participation in common meals, he is constantly depicted as tweaking these various conventions. He advises that the most highly honored participant ought to prescind from claims to precedence, Luke 14:7-11, and that one's guest list ought not to include one's friends, but the destitute, who could never repay the hospitality, Luke 14:12-14. He and his followers do not wash before eating, Mark 7:1-8, Luke 11:37-41. And Jesus declares all foods clean, Mark 7:14-23, Luke 11:41. There are women at table with Jesus, and he does not chase them away, Mark 14:3-9, Luke 7:36-50. He eats with the clean, Luke 7:36, 14:1, and the unclean, Mark 2:15-17, 14:3. And whether Jesus did so or not, many of his earliest followers felt authorized by his teaching to cross ethnic boundaries and to eat with Gentiles, Galatians 2:11-14, Acts 10. Jesus seems to have initiated a very peculiar, open practice of table fellowship. Crossan thinks that the significance of this very central aspect of Jesus' praxis is captured by the parable of the Great Feast. Here it is in its Lucan form. A person once gave a great banquet and invited many guests, and when it came time for the banquet, he sent his servant around to the invited guests to say, "Come, for everything is now ready." But they all, one after another, began to make excuses. The first guest said to him, "I've bought a field and must go out to look it over. Please pass along my regrets." And another said, "I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and must go examine them. Please pass along my regrets." And another said, "I have just gotten married and so cannot come." So the servant went and reported this to his master. Then the householder got angry and said to his servant, "Go out right away into the streets and alleys of the city and bring in the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame." And the servant said, "What you have commanded has been done, but there is still room." So the master said to the servant, "Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, so that my house might be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited shall ever taste my banquet." Luke 14:16b-24. For the most part, this parable is as close to the version Jesus originally told as we can get, with the exception of one critical element. Almost everyone agrees that Luke seems to entertain a special regard for the poor. In fact, the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame in Luke 14:21 echoes a Lucan phrase introduced in the story directly preceding this parable in Luke's Gospel. See Luke 14:12-14. Thus, the instruction to go out right away into the streets and alleys of the city and bring in the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame represents a particularly Lucan way of drawing out the significance of the parable. One should practice charity in one's common meals. Luke's interpretation of this parable is admirable but very conventional. It restricts the parameters of the parable well within the bounds of social manageability. But if this is to be ascribed to Luke, what is left to the original parable's resolution? Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in so that my house might be filled. The peculiar and challenging thing about this parable is just this. The doors to the banquet hall are to be thrown wide open. Go out to the highways and bring in whomever you might find there, men and women, friend and foe, the clean and unclean, Jews and Gentiles, princes and thieves. Anyone who dares to respond to the invitation may come inside. This is a table without controls, a table without boundaries. It represents a community in which all are welcomed, into which all may come. This is an open table, a table far less manageable and far more threatening than the charitable table of Luke. In fact, as Crossan so succinctly puts it, generous almsgiving may even be conscience's last great refuge against the terror of open commensality. The Basilia of God. Now one might say all of this is good teaching. It makes sense, especially to poor people or to persons who are interested in working for a more open and egalitarian society. But is it more than that? Is it more than good teaching? Is it the empire of God? This is to press beyond the question of social formation and ethics. It is to ask a theologica question. Willie Markson liked to remind us that not everyone who heard Jesus and experienced him firsthand had the same reaction. Some said, "This guy is a nut." Others said, "This is good teaching, admirable, interesting." But others said, "In this person's words and deeds, I have experienced God's very own presence in my life." Some people gathered around Jesus' open table and said, "Whoa, I'm never going to do that again. Eating with the unclean, that's just not what God-fearing people do." Others said, Now that was interesting. Perhaps I'll try it again sometime. But others said, around that table I experienced something I would claim as nothing less than the very love and acceptance of God. It is God who calls us to such tables. The words I heard from Jesus were the word of God. Is this good teaching, or does this activity unveil the fundamental principle of the universe? At such tables do we discover the very ground of all being? That is what early Christians risked believing, that what they learned from Jesus and experienced in his presence was not just a good teaching or way of life and ethic, though it was all of these. Rather, it was an expression of who they would claim God to be. To them, Jesus was a sign act of who God is. It is God who offers everyone the means to life, unbrokered, freely given as a gift. Jesus' unbrokered empire is the empire of God. This is what those who chose to follow Jesus experienced as good news, gospel. The unbrokered empire of God is the gospel of Jesus. But is Jesus' unbrokered empire of God really good news? History, of course, cannot tell us this. It can tell us only that some people did experience it that way and chose to give themselves over to that reality as a life-transforming vocation. History can tell us what Jesus said and did within limits. It can even tell us what the followers of Jesus, or later interpreters of Jesus, like Paul or the gospel writers, believed was the real significance of what he said and did. But history cannot tell us if any of this is true. It cannot tell us what we ought to believe. It cannot compel us to risk, as early Christians did, the claim that in Jesus they had come to know who God is. Faith is always a claim, a risk to believe. Historical research cannot minimize that risk, nor should it try. But historical research can clarify the nature of the risk one is asked to take in embracing Jesus' words and deeds as gospel. To ask about the historical Jesus is to ask just what it was that earliest Christians were confessing when they risked the claim that in Jesus they had come to know God. Was it good news? Is there gospel in the words and deeds of Jesus? This is the risk and the claim that Christian faith invites one to make.